our current climate movement is really not being effective at channeling that mass majoritarian power of the working class. And so we have to think about how they could. And the argument I would make is that a much more sort of materialist climate program that's centered, things that could actually address people's end of month struggles would be much more effective.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Matt Hoover. Matt is a professor at the Syracuse University and the author of Climate Change as Class War, Building Socialism on a Warming Planet. Matt joined me today to discuss the argument in his book that the professional class of environmentalists has failed to understand the material reality of the working class and failed to develop policies or ideas that would benefit the reality that many people around the world are facing, the struggle to get to the end of the month. He argues that it is only by building up the power base of the working class that we will be able to combat petro-privatisation and roll out a Green New Deal, leveraging public sector investment to decarbonise, transition, and radically improve the lives of people all over the world. He says that rather than targeting the rich for their individual and consumption behaviours, we should be targeting those who still own the means of production, because the fossil fuel means of production are directly damaging human and planetary health, and we need to bring them back into public ownership. And to do that, we need to build the working class power base. This is a conversation about large-scale transformation, systemic incentives, messaging, morality, politics, and class. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Matt, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I asked you to come on the show to discuss your book, Climate Change as Class War. But you're going to get the first question that everybody does, and I assume that you're going to answer it through the prism of that research. But to begin with, why is the world in crisis?
Well, I think on the left, the typical answer to that question is capitalism. And it's this sort of system that's, driving a lot of ecological destruction, driving increasing emissions and so forth. And certainly I agree with that. But one thing the book tries to do is kind of be a little more specific about trying to actually integrate a class analysis into that understanding of why capitalism's to blame for this crisis. So instead of just sort of blaming this kind of big amorphous system called capitalism, which again is the core of the problem, we can actually think about it as a class of capitalists who are really the ones who have the power that are driving our planet into crisis. So, and again, there's been a lot of discussion on the left and in climate circles about how the climate crisis is caused by the rich or the wealthy. And what the book's trying to respond to is like typically that analysis tends to focus on the rich and wealthy for their kind of carbon footprint. Like they're rich, they have a lot of money, they spend their money on beef and flying and big houses, and they consume a lot, and therefore they're the you can just sort of do an analysis of who has the most income, who is consuming the most, and they're to blame for the crisis. So what I try to point out is that sort of vision of class is not particularly Marxist. It's a vision of class that only looks at someone's income and their consumption and their lifestyle practices, only looks at how they spend their money. And Marxist analysis of class really is more, it's not even about consumption. It's about your relationship to what they call the means of production. And it's really about who owns the means of production and how they generate the money that allows them to consume so much. So who are the investors? Who are the owners who actually own the companies that are causing all this ecological distraction? I mean, you could have a CEO of a fossil fuel company who actually has a low carbon footprint. They could be a vegetarian. They could take public transit. They could have very low emissions on the consumption side, but in their work life as an owner and investor, they're profiting off the core cause of climate change, right? And so the analysis really tries to put more attention on that side of the equation, which is ownership, and to say that if we're really going to solve climate change, it's really about building the kind of power we would need to take on the power of those who own the systems of production that are causing so much crisis. Just this morning, I was reading the Financial Times, and British Petroleum has announced, we're probably going to scale back on our climate targets because we've found that, wow, oil and gas is still really profitable. And they were posting record profits in the last couple of years. And that's what the capitalist class is really. They're just sort of guided by profits, and they're going to seek to make profits on their investments above any other consideration. And so again, unfortunately, much of our energy system and much of our industrial production system is controlled by this class of people that own it and try to drive it for profit. And getting them to stop is going to take huge social power to really force them to stop, or to take those systems under a different kind of ownership that could restructure them towards investments that actually are built towards stabilizing our climate problem. And so that kind of power equation is a really difficult one. And what the way I start the book is just basically trying to say to the climate movement, like, hey, we're actually losing this power struggle. I mean, fossil fuels are as profitable as ever. Emissions keep rising. The temperatures keep rising. And so we really got to have a much more serious analysis of power and how we're going to take on the people that have the power so that we can stop this.
That's brilliant. Consumption is something that comes up a lot on this show. It's something I've written about. And it is very interesting to think of it as possibly yet another narrative that has been seeded to like offset responsibility or distract from the main systems of power, as you're saying. Because Absolutely. Even if we're talking about, the consumption of the rich, how is it that they are generating the revenue in order to fund the lifestyles, in order to have access to such carbon intensive activities, et cetera, et cetera? Yes, it is through the means of production. Or, I mean, Yanis Varoufakis has recently sort of been going on about the fact that we don't really live in a means of production world anymore, but more a means of communication. The people who hold the keys to the communication systems are the people that hold the keys to power. So maybe let's go there first. I mean, we seem to sort of be existing in this quite bizarre moment whereby the world is still very much material. Of course it is, because it always will be. And yet there's this like other economy that takes up so much of our headspace and so much of our conversation. The digital economy and the drive to digitize, as if we can decarbonize by digitizing. And even with regards to things like artificial intelligence, there seems to be this kind of like rewriting of the capitalist rules. Like, these things are not making money. They're not providing any good benefit. They're not even really providing any benefit to corporations, and yet they're soaking up loads and loads and loads of capital and giving very little reward. So how is it that, maybe let's start here, like how is it that the landscape has changed to what Marx was writing about a couple of centuries ago, that we now need to like update when we're using a Marxist analysis on means of production, class analysis, who's in what class, etc.? Because even the capitalist class seems to be sort of being mowed over by the system itself right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's not particularly fashionable, but I actually try to argue that we're still living with the class analysis that Marx lays forth, because he did this analysis in the 19th century, and that was in the midst of a world historical energy transition towards fossil fuel. And prior to that, basically, most work in the economy that had to get done had to be done by muscle power or very little bits of water power or wind power. And so human and animal muscle were the driving, what Marxists would call the productive forces of the economy. And this shift to fossil fuel powered automatic machinery is just completely transformed our productive capacity, completely transformed the relationship between workers and capitalists, to be more about machines and who control those machines. And from the climate perspective, I mean, we're still living with that transformation to fossil fuels. We still live in a world 80% powered by fossil fuels. Like you said, it's still a very much material world. And that material world is still 80% powered by fossil fuels. It's still a world built by of steel and concrete and highly. This is more a 20th century phenomenon, but highly industrialized food systems and agriculture. So one of the points I try to make in the book is that really the climate crisis is really about this industrial production system, and that's again this thing that really takes off in the 19th century. And in my view, again, many people want to talk about, capitalism's over, we're in techno-feudalism or whatever. But my view, a lot of those systems, a lot of those industrial material systems are still have the same class relations as the ones, not the exact same, but similar class relations that Marx identified as driving the capitalist mode of production. And more importantly, I would say that really what Marx identifies as the sort of crucial social relation of capitalism is wage labor, and the fact that the vast majority of people in a capitalist society have to sell their labor power on a market for a wage to survive. And to me, that is still very much the case. And even more to the point, not only do we still have this sort of 19th century industrial economy humming along, but even the stuff that is called sort of dematerialized digital tech, obviously we know that is also extremely material. And we know that server farms and the need for data storage has just created crazy amounts of energy needs and energy sources. And now with artificial intelligence, the projections of the amount of energy AI systems are going to require are through the roof. It's just sort of insane. I mean, we were getting really upset lately about Bitcoin mining and how much energy that was requiring, but AI is going to just make Bitcoin mining look like this sort of tiny little hobby thing that people did. So, and again, I think in terms of power in wealth accumulation, it really is these tech companies that are making all the money. But in terms of climate, we still do have a lot of powerful capitalists who control this system. And again, the most profitable companies in 2022 were oil and gas and coal companies. I mean, the fossil fuel companies are still making lots of money. They're still extremely powerful, despite all of the attention and all the incredible wealth that the tech giants are also making.
It's such an interesting point that the companies that are causing the most damage to the planet's ecosystems, and thus to our own health and social cohesion and all of these kinds of things, are the most profitable. And yet the companies that are the most visible, in Silicon Valley, say, are like these sort of like speculative creatures that are attracting a huge amount of capital and not delivering actually any returns or any profits or anything right now, and actually are hemorrhaging. That sort of seems to be what's going on right now in Silicon Valley. A lot of them are hemorrhaging quarterly now. And to me, I kind of read that as like capitalism kind of coming to its own end in a sense. Like these, the limits of firmly believing that wealth is somehow divorced from the planet's biosphere, and that the more wealth that one has, the more that one can make wealth, as if wealth is not this like material transformation of resources, like natural abundance, natural resources into something individuated and personal. That to me seems to be kind of what's happening. It's like, you know that cartoon where I can't remember what cartoon it is, but where that character like runs off the edge of a cliff and its legs are still going in the air before it drops.
Roadrunner.
Like that to me seems, okay, Roadrunner. That to me seems kind of what's happening to capitalism now. And so I wonder then, how much should we be worrying about taking down capitalism as a system when it already seems to be sort of like transforming and reacting as well to state pressures, you know, like governments are now getting involved. And yeah, actually let's just go there. Yeah. Because things are obviously changing.
To bring up the financial terms again this morning, they had this insane analysis of how much investment is required to address the climate crisis, something like $9 trillion a year. And in 2021 and 2022, we reached, I think it was something like 2 trillion. And it shows this chart where the gap of what has been invested and what is needed. And it's just so far away from what we would actually require to kind of get us closer to these Paris targets, essentially. It feels like governments are doing things, but it still seems like even where I am in the United States, like as much as we're talking about industrial policy and the government kind of trying to make investments, you know, what the Inflation Reduction Act is a bunch of tax credits for mostly private capital to do the investing. And still we have people like John Kerry, the sort of head, he just stepped down as the head climate envoy, just saying like governments don't have this money. We're going to just have to rely on the private sector to do it. And the private sector is not doing it, right? And we simply just keep hoping they will. Now, in terms of your overall question, I would, if we are in that Roadrunner situation, I'm not very optimistic that a like left or a social justice movement will have much ability to win over the situation in the context of a Roadrunner like collapse of the entire some fear of like a coming like sort of climate breakdown or tipping points or whatever. I think in those types of emergency conditions are much more favorable for the right and for a kind of really very scary kind of eco-fascism or some kind of thing, because when the conditions for the reproduction of life for more and more people it's already the case for many people around the world that the reproduction of life is not possible. But if that becomes generalized, I think it helps the right more than the left. So that's why I think we actually have to build this kind of power sooner rather than later to try to guide this transition in a kind of rational way so that we can actually, create conditions for justice and planetary stability. But I think the core problem is, again, not to beat a dead horse, but, Marx identified capital is one thing. It's what he called M prime. It's money. You invest it in commodities and you come out with M prime, which is more money at the end of the day. And so just investing money, seeking a return on your investment, that's what drives capital. But as you're suggesting, all this capital is flowing into Silicon Valley and there's not a lot of M prime. There's not a lot of returns. There's And that's the same problem with the energy transition. There's a great new book that just came out by Brett Christophers that you've probably heard of called The Price is Wrong. A lot of money might be flowing into renewables, but capitalists aren't really that enticed by the returns. It's not really seen as sufficiently profitable to invest in clean energy and so forth. And that's, some political economists have noticed that actually that's been a sort of problem within capitalism for the last really like 50 years. So people like Robert Brenner and Aaron Beninoff have called like the post-1970s capitalist economy they've called it the long downturn. And we've been in this period of kind of stagnation where growth is low and profit rates are low. And capital is really not finding a lot of profitable outlets for its investment. And in those conditions, that's why I think we got to stop waiting for the private sector and for capital to kind of save us, because they're pretty finicky. They want profits, and they're not finding it really in green energy. They're not finding it in Silicon Valley. Well, some are, but there's not a lot of profits to be had. So capital is really not into investing, right? And to me, like the core of the climate crisis, it's really a question of investment. We need to build a totally new energy system. Again, we currently have one 80% powered by fossil fuels. If we're going to change that, it's going to require a world historical level of investment. And capitalism has not really been proving to be good at investment outside of China, let's say, for the last several decades. So the question is, what would? And for me, that's why we really have to look at these sort of historical examples of public sector led investment, where it's really the public sector that comes in and makes these kind of long-term infrastructure types investments that, again, capital is not all that interested in those types of really long-term infrastructural investments like roads and water treatment systems. That's why we have public infrastructure, because capital is not really interested in that kind of stuff. So anyway, I think to even get there, we have to kind of change the conversation and stop sort of thinking like if we put out the right tax credits or incentives, then all of a sudden, finance and capital and ESG and all this stuff is going to come to our rescue, because I just don't see that happening.
Let's talk about how we do it then, how we build this power base. And let's add in like a little bit of context about, the situation that we're in today, but leave out the big how questions of like, just how sort of corrupted now politics is, the revolving door between industry and politicians all over the world now. Like, leaving that aside, how is it in a world in which we are seeing growing wealth inequality within nations? Does the working class or the middle class are increasingly squeezed? How do we get together to build a power base to improve public sector-led investment or regain public ownership of the means of production?
That's a big question. So basically, I argue that in a certain sense, I just try to sort of resuscitate or recover a kind of perspective in Marxism that does see really the working class as the sort of the key agent of transformation of large scale power. Really, if you want to build a kind of large scale countervailing power to the power of capital, history has shown that really the working class can build that kind of formidable power. Now, of course, the problem is, as you suggest, is that power has been systematically crushed for the last several decades. There's a Marxist here in the US called Adolf Reed, who has a great quote where he says, neoliberalism is just capitalism without a working class opposition. Basically, neoliberalism is just capital gone wild, right? It's just capitalism has full reign over everything, and as you said, the revolving door and all this stuff. But so that to me means going back to basics and some basic ideas about this working class agency and Marxist theory are that obviously what capitalism does is it sort of turns the majority of society, the majority of workers and producers into these kind of proletarians who are again, sort of insecure in their basic existence. They have to sell their labor power for a wage in order to survive. But therefore they do create this kind of power base that they are the majority of society. This sort of, if we're thinking about solving climate change democratically, then we have to look to this sort of vast majority of society in the working class. And what I try to argue in the book is that the climate movement so far is, has generally been concentrated in much smaller aspects of what I call the professional class, what some would call the professional managerial class, or some have called the petty bourgeois class. But typically the climate movement is made up of people highly educated in professional fields like science and scientists, academics, people that work for NGOs or non-governmental organizations, people that work for government, people that have credentials and are been able to, I've sort of come to say that even these people could be classified as proletarians because they do have to sell their labor power, but they tend to sell it for a salary and have a more secure basis of existence. It's this sort of middle class kind of security that the professional class tries to attain. And that's what I would argue is the core of the climate movement, are these sort of professionals. But they are kind of, what I argue is they're kind of cut off from the larger majority of society that is living a more precarious existence, that doesn't have university education. In the United States, it's like close to 2/3 of the workforce doesn't have a university education. So this is, these are sort of small minorities of society that often traffic in really morally righteous rhetoric about climate justice and about, indigenous peoples and global South and all this stuff, but are somewhat cut off from the majority of working people. And therefore, as we've seen, whether it be Germany or the United States, or this kind of green or this kind of climate politics has not really been able to resonate with the larger masses, as I would say. The classic example from France with the yellow vests erupting in protests saying that politicians care about the end of the world, we're trying to get to the end of the month, kind of shows that a lot of sort of working people do not see the climate crisis as sort of front and center as part of their material concerns and their sort of end of month life struggles that they're trying to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And God, I again, this question, I could probably talk for a couple hours, but I try to argue that there's sort of reasons why the professional class tends to center climate politics around knowledge and knowing the science and belief or denial of the science. So, and again, that resonates with a highly educated, science literate population, but not so much with people, with the larger masses who are just trying to get to the end of the month, right? And then I also talk about how professional class people tend to get into this sort of climate technocracy where they're really interested in little wonky kind of solutions like carbon pricing, where you can kind of create these little smart technocratic policies that will kind of channel markets and the profit motives to solve the crisis. And it turns out those are very attractive to educated wonk people, but not to the masses of people. And carbon pricing is horribly unpopular. It doesn't really resonate with masses of people. And then I do have a critique of more sort of the radical, what I call the anti-system radicals, who are also professionals. They're concentrated in NGOs and academia and kind of have this radical rhetoric about capitalism, but tend toward small scale types of, even sometimes like anarchist solutions, and a sort of critique of consumerism that gets back to this thing we were talking about earlier, which is like focusing so much on consumption and lowering consumption that kind of, again, doesn't quite resonate with masses of people who certainly don't feel like they're excessive or consuming too much, and are just struggling to meet their basic needs. And so that's a long story of saying that our current climate movement is really not being effective at channeling that mass majoritarian power of the working class. And so we have to think about how they could. And the argument I would make is that a much more sort of materialist climate program that's centered, things that could actually address people's end of month struggles would be much more effective. So obviously, we were very excited about like the prospect of a Green New Deal that would center jobs and social programs that, in our country, actually giving healthcare to people, like actually appealing to people's sort of material lives, and sort of trying to see climate crisis and inequality crisis as two sides of the same coin. Why don't we address them both at the same time? And one of the main points I would make is that most of the sectors that we need to transform to get off of this 80% fossil fuel are sectors like transportation, housing, energy, food. These are actually core working class material needs. These are the end of month struggles, right? But it's almost like we haven't even really settled on that kind of materialist program that would really resonate with the working class, that would say that actually our program's about giving you more secure access to these basic material needs while we decarbonize those sectors. Because I think people have just sort of had this knee-jerk idea that decarbonization is going to cost a lot. So really, if we're going to decarbonize, it's going to lead to higher costs for people. And that's not a good way to win them over. So I think we have to try to build that kind of program that would be about decarbonization plus more secure access to those material needs. Now that's basically the idea of how to kind of channel a broad working class politics toward climate change. The other part of the book is really thinking about how we can channel the other part of working class power, which is the fact that workers do all the work in society and they can withdraw their labor and go on strike and use their leverage as workers to really build power in the workplace and also in larger society through the power of strikes. And so that brings to the question of like how to channel the labor movement and unions into a climate struggle. Now I could go on that, but maybe I should pause because I've already talked quite a long time.
The material thing, it sounds a lot like, the Degrowth Manifestos that are laid out by eco-socialists. Transforming the world to make it better for everybody also helps the planet. So, 4-day work week, green job guarantee, public housing, decarbonize public transport, etc., etc. But I suppose I think that something I just kind of want to push back on is, how do I put this? It's funny because a lot of the times when I speak to people about like story and narrative, I'm the person that's like, no, but you've got to think about the material stuff. And yet here I want to push back with you on the material stuff about narrative and story, because I think that for whatever reason, the United States of America really hasn't learned its lesson with regards to the Trump election in 2016 and how the Democrats are behaving. Even though, Biden has taken a much more kind of strident approach to his administration and done quite a lot, especially with regards to, the Inflation Reduction Act. There seems to still be very little interest in like what makes the working class tick with regards to like what are they interested in and what are they being told and what do they desire for themselves. Because if we live in a world of such an inequality where the lifestyles of the very, very few are kind of like paraded in this narrative war as something to aspire to, when our relationships to one another have been eroded to the point where like autonomous individuality is seen as the number one prize or goal, or reality even of most people. It's all very well to think about, hey, here are all the good things that we can offer you. But the reality is a lot of people are voting against things that would be good for them. We're seeing that. We saw that with Brexit in the United Kingdom. We're seeing it with the far right all over Europe. We're seeing it with Trump in 2016 and now again in 2024. And so what is it that, we, the professional class, the climate people, your middle class climate bloody intellectuals, whatever it is that you want to identify us having this conversation. What is it that we are not getting? Because it seems to me that is a shadow in, between the words of everything that you're saying here.
Yeah. We've obviously heard this sort of question of why does the working class sort of vote against their interests, right? There was I think it came out 20 years ago. There's a book called What's the Matter with Kansas, and tried to analyze like how what used to be a very sort of labor union, left-wing democratic state of Kansas sort of shifted so starkly to the right. But I really have a problem with that question because that question presumes that the sort of center left parties are delivering what the working class needs. But again, that's sort of the long history of neoliberalism has been how these center left parties have abandoned the working class, and it's not just that they've abandoned them; they've pursued policies that are directly antagonistic to that working class. In the United States, it was not Ronald Reagan; it was Bill Clinton who eviscerated the welfare system. It was Bill Clinton who passed NAFTA, which destroyed a lot of industrial areas. And it was Bill Clinton who deregulated finance in Wall Street that led to the financial crisis. Yeah. And it was Barack Obama who basically after that crisis sort of basically filled his cabinet with all the people that caused it with Wall Street and the Federal Reserve, and then basically helped oversee the bailout of finance while homeowners who were foreclosed upon by the millions were given this highly bureaucratic homeowner relief program that no one could figure out how to use. And for instance, the foreclosure crisis was most terrible for Black families who actually had built up some kind of wealth before the crisis, and then it was Black families that saw foreclosures at a disproportionate rate. And so, in those years of Obama, like once again, the Democrats were not showing anything to the working class. And so in that context, what the working class really wants is a person that's going to call out the elites and the powerful for their complete incapacity to do anything for those end of month struggles and do anything for the working class. And unfortunately, in that context of abandonment by the center left parties, who have found, as Thomas Piketty and others have shown, like now their base is now in the professional class, really affluent, much more educated voters are drifting to the center left parties, the parties that used to be the parties of the working class. And so in that context, like unfortunately a kind of xenophobic, racist and right-wing appeals to people's anxieties and hatreds, and that can work. And oftentimes those racist appeals do have this kind of anti-establishment tinge, and people are angry at the establishment or at the government because of, again, they haven't done anything. And so, unfortunately, I kind of would say like, if we want people to vote with their interests, we actually have to do things that actually would appeal to their interests and deliver. Yeah. And still with Biden, I'm not convinced that he is really, like, he's done some sort of the lowest level form of student debt relief that you could imagine. And that's even had some legal troubles. And polling, I haven't looked at this recently, but 8 months ago, polling on the Inflation Reduction Act basically showed that something like 75% of people have never even heard of it. And to me, this is part of the whole calculus. Like we're giving tax credits to private capital to build all these infrastructures and factories. So people don't think of they don't think of these investments as political projects or as Bidenomics or Biden anything. They think of them, the flagship is the company that's investing. So I live in a town called Syracuse. There's a chip company called Micron that's plowing huge amounts of millions into investing in some chip factories. And no one's talking about, well, the more educated people are talking about it, of course, But most people are talking about this as the Micron investment, right? They're not seeing it as this big sort of political intervention by Biden to kind of, lift up this Rust Belt town that's been abandoned by capital for so many decades. And so all across the country, I think people see these investments, but they're not really seeing them as part of this political project. And then add on top of that, you have the sort of slow burn of inflation and the cost of living crisis that is just hammering working class families and leaving them totally flamed by grocery bills and increasing utility bills. And so people in the Biden orbit will just say, well, this is really frustrating because our numbers show that the economy is really good. It's like generating a lot of jobs and the unemployment rate is low. And why are these people not understanding? And again, they're not really doing a ton to really very visibly and clearly appeal to those interests and deliver to the material interests of the working class. They're just sort of hoping like people can look at statistics and understand, well, I don't feel very good, but the economy is good because the economists said it's good. So, and then, when you look at some profiles of what the 2024 campaign is really going to be about, Biden has said it's going to be about democracy and saving democracy, which is very abstract and very not like, the type of campaign that us Bernie Sanders people would want to focus on, which would be, about attacking that inequality, attacking the rich who have hijacked the entire economy for themselves, and really centering kind of core public goods, public investments, and things that people could really see in their lives that would benefit them. That doesn't seem to be what Biden is really interested in. And then we'll see what happens in 2024. But I'm sure if Trump were to win, people are going to be like, whoa, we can't believe it. Why would the working class vote against their interests? They're going to say that. But again, we have to prove to the working class we have a platform and a politics that delivers to their interests. And we haven't been doing that for decades.
Yeah, I think it's also complicated that even if you get these ideas off the ground with regards to material interests, you're coming up against so many different cultural stories that sort of undermine those public goods. Like, the ownership of private property as being a way to distinguish oneself and identify oneself and finding a place in the world. Or in the United Kingdom, the bloody government made your right to own a car about freedom. Like car ownership became synonymous with freedom in one of their campaigns a couple of months ago. And I think that this is part of a problem with the climate movement with regards to the necessity to have a vision into which you can invite people. The dangers, though, of having a vision that are like very sort of top down. And also I think that there's perhaps a lack of understanding that a lot of people aren't there yet. Like, it isn't their dream to sort of be able to take public transport everywhere and to have free, affordable housing, or to live in community or whatever. Like, there are still these like massive cultural gulfs between the left and the right, not just political gulfs. And I don't think that we have quite figured out yet how to establish a vision that has space enough for there to be a diversity in the way that people live. And I think that's probably why the right wing is still holding out and still maintains a lot of its power, despite being like caricaturely, just badly organized actually right now, is the fact that there is an element of like diversity, of individual diversity in the right-wing vision, in that whatever you can think of, you can make it happen if you're lucky, and if this and if that, but it's still a possibility. Whereas the left, when it goes for power in order to do public good, tends to always coalesce around this like idea of a necessity of unity, which is another centralizing force that people are rightly nervous about. And better the devil that you know than the change, essentially, I think.
Yeah, it's tough. You might enjoy my first book's really about how out of the crisis of the New Deal, uh, the crisis of the Great Depression, the New Deal in many ways was trying to kind of harness the power of public investment to create a geography of privatism, right? It basically underwrote the whole construction of, this is very U.S. focused, but the construction of the suburbs and automobile dependence, and I argue, the energetic basis of this is oil, and it sort of powered this kind of petro-privatism. And in the ensuing decades, more and more of these sort of suburbanites started to, even though their whole life was made possible by public investment, they started to forget that and started to sort of channel this very populist anti-government and anti-tax type of politics, which really erupted in the 70s, and we've been living with it ever since. But again, I would argue in that ensuing period, no one is really investing in a public alternative that could really materially actually benefit people. Now, I agree with you. I think in the world we have today, especially the US, where everything's so spread out and people are living in these sort of atomized, dispersed suburban geographies, public transit is not exactly a slam dunk. It's not gonna, if we build it, they will come type of situation. Now, but when you started to go down the list, I would disagree with you that public housing would not be a slam dunk. In terms, we have in this country, and I'm pretty sure in the UK and Europe, we have a massive housing crisis where rents are like skyrocketing, and all the private equity firms are just buying up all the housing and jacking up the rent and jacking up and now interest rates are higher. People can't afford to buy homes. I mean, it's just complete catastrophe in the housing front. So I do think if we were to build real, as Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they just announced a Green New Deal for public housing. We actually, and unfortunately, it's the type of sort of proposal that has no chance of passing in the current Congress with the current power balance where it is. But if we were to really, really pursue that kind of program and really started to deliver massive public housing, affordable, or even, a socialist dream of decommodified housing as a human right, like these types of things, I think if we actually started to deliver them, would start to build huge popular support. I think it's very basic. The problem is it's like a chicken or egg situation. We're not delivering. And so, therefore, working class people are hugely suspicious and skeptical of any kind of promise of real change that could improve their lives, because they've seen no evidence that politics or the political system can deliver in these ways. So that's why I think, we got a little probably, what do they say, above our skis. And in both the Corbyn and the Sanders moment, it's like, we're going to do this revolution by catapulting to the executive, like the highest power of the whole government. Corbyn or Sanders is going to then just bring socialism to the executive office. Generally in history, it really requires, before you could get to that, you have to actually build working class organization, actual parties that could deliver things at a local level, or actual unions that build up the actual power to win a massive contract like the United Auto Workers just won with their strike in the fall. And when you start to build organization and you start to deliver real material gains to people, people start to believe that, hey, if I get involved in this movement, if I get involved in this struggle, I'll actually see real improvements. And it's that kind of more on the ground organization and real delivery of material benefits that has to really be built before you could start to see it translate into big, large scale political electoral transformations. So unfortunately, we're still I think, at the early stages of building that kind of organization. And but I think you got to build that first before you're going to see the working class really move in a progressive direction. And until we build it, I think the working class is rightly going to be attracted to sort of, well, maybe not rightly, but understandably attracted to a right-wing version of populism that sort of is about attacking elites and racism and whatever. So, I've been telling this anecdote where I was in Denmark promoting the book and meeting with a lot of climate activists in Copenhagen, and all of them were really, living that kind of very urban activist lives. They talked a lot about degrowth and solidarity with the global South, and they had all the lingo down. But during that time, Denmark had an election the very week I was there, and the left did horribly. It was a big shift to the right. And Jacobin did some analysis of the election that showed that a lot of the voters shifting to the right in Denmark were industrial workers and also workers in the wind industry. Right? So the like most important green industry workers that you would think would be most in touch and aligned with a kind of climate justice type of politics, they were shifting away from that politics completely. And so if we can't really even win over the wind workers, we've got to sort of we've got to look critically at our organizing. Because I think when I talk about building organization, it does have to be organization that's not insular and not building sort of little micro activist sects, and actually is building outward into that working class, trying to always organizing. Really, the bread and butter of organizing is always trying to talk to people who don't agree with you and try to win over people who are skeptical of your politics and win them into the struggle. And that sort of outward looking towards a kind of mass politics is, I think, lacking in our current movements.
Interesting. I come from a working class area in Scotland, and the wind industry there picked up a lot of young men like ages ago, like a decade and a half ago, to train them up as apprentices and become wind engineers. So these guys didn't go to university; they just went straight into industry, essentially. Mm-hmm. And from the ones I've spoken to, I don't think it's nothing to do with climate. It was never anything to do with climate. It's about the fact that it was a good job. Yeah. They were treated well. It was a growing, they were told it's a growing industry. Like, you will likely always have a job in this. And the pay was really great. It remains to be great. And they get to travel the world and do all this kind of stuff. And so it's like, it's quite interesting, I think, with regards to, again, left, right, and especially what we're seeing now, where everything has sort of become this like moral debate as opposed to material discussion, and even as opposed to story swapping. Like, there is a difference between these ideological stances and being able to construct narratives and try things on for size and see what fits for people. Because a lot of what is driving the debate on both sides with regards to like everything now is just, it's the right thing to do. You should behave this way because we need to protect our kids, or, from the drag queens, or you should be doing this because we need to be in solidarity with the global South. And no matter what way you cut it, it's a lot of people who have a lot of time to think about these issues and come up with the talking points, telling the vast majority of people what it is that they need to like think or feel. And making it a matter of morality, which is just a dead end, because, there's nothing really to discuss when it comes down to moral debates. That's the very nature of morality. It is what you think and believe, and you stick to your guns. And so it's quite interesting to think about, like, how is it that we can maybe, like, how can we move out of this, like, space of morality and focus on these like material realities and tell stories about them, but in a way that isn't about numbers and science and shoulds and fears, but rather speaking to, what it is that individuals want. Because this is the thing with climate, it's so big. It is so big. We're talking about the whole world changing so much for the next few decades, already changing so much. And yet still within it, an ecosystem is made up of the agents within that ecosystem and their relationships. Like, we still live in a world where people are individuals and think about saving their own skin. That's sort of the nature of biology. And how is it that we can construct stories about the material realities that the Green New Deal is offering that also speaks to like that very normal desire to like secure oneself?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, in many ways, trying to center what you started with those wind workers. I mean, we've been talking a lot about, the answer to the kind of impasse between labor and environmentalists or between unions is jobs, right? It's going to focus on jobs. And, but jobs is also abstract, right? We need to make it about good jobs, life-sustaining, community-sustaining, family-sustaining jobs. And that sounds great for the Scottish wind workers. I know a lot of the jobs in the even sort of under the flagship of the Inflation Reduction Act are not necessarily union jobs. Not a lot of them are very precarious jobs, and particularly there's been some great reporting. A labor journalist named Lauren or Lori Gurley and Lee Harris, who have shown that actually in the solar industry, the jobs are extremely, exploitative, precarious, temporary. We're talking about temporary construction jobs. From Gurley, the report showed that these workers are exposed to hazards like extreme heat and alligators and snakes in these sort of remote solar farm construction jobs. So, and a lot of wind industry workers have found that they can get better unionized jobs doing fossil fuel type work or pipeline work, and that's not going to work for us, right? So, and so again, it's kind of a chicken and egg question. How are we going to build a kind of massive jobs program that could actually convince masses of industrial workers that building a new energy system and building climate solutions could be good for themselves and also good for the planet. Again, I come back to like, that's not really going to happen without the public sector leading the role or leading the way. And that's why I do take a lot of inspiration from the original New Deal, which was really about centering the government as the sort of when capitalism was in crisis, is the government was going to build all this really useful infrastructure that we needed. And not only things like schools and libraries and public pools and electricity networks to rural areas where capitalists would not service them because it wasn't profitable enough. But also the New Deal did a lot of conservation work. They planted trees, they did soil conservation programs, they did flood management. It was trying to address what was a sort of massive ecological crisis with the Dust Bowl and soil erosion and all this kind of stuff. And, some would point out they didn't get it all ecologically beautiful and correct. From a climate perspective, massive hydroelectricity is kind of useful, but some would point out that also requires a kind of ecological devastation in another sense. But in any event, I think that sort of New Deal model has a lot to say for it in terms of, and guess what? Like, out of that sort of big New Deal politics came literally one of the most popular presidents in our history, who won by massive landslides in 1936, and then built this kind of huge Democratic Party majority for decades after that. I was just listening to something that I think said that the Democratic Party had a majority in the House of Representatives between 1954 and 1994. They built up this huge, long-lasting, powerful majority. And I think, again, to go back to what we've been talking about, like the way they built that majority doing stuff that helped people, like actually delivering to the material interests of the working class, which is not what we've done. But I do want to get back. I totally agree with you that unfortunately, so much of our climate discourse and climate politics is just purely people, this is sort of overused, but pure virtue signaling. It's like about moral righteousness. And sometimes that bleeds, I think, into whoever has the more sort of morally righteous and radical proposal is seen as the most in the good and so forth. That there's no sense that we have to really win over and appeal to the masses of people. It's about who can distinguish themselves with the most morally righteous position. There's this academic who's part of this podcast, the Bunga cast, named George Hoare, who wrote an article that was about what he called moral minoritarianism. And that, to me, a lot of the left is really wrapped up in that kind of virtue signaling, sort of who can be the most righteous and the most radical and the most moral, without any sense of how do we build a majoritarian kind of politics that could actually lead to the kind of political power. Because that's the key thing. It's not, you can be morally right, but not have any power. And unfortunately, the people that are morally wrong, the capitalists, have all the power. And so apart from the morality, we have to think about power and how do you build power. And that's what's really lacking. And I think it's understandable because we haven't had power for decades. And so when you think about how to counter the power of capital, it just becomes like, well, it just becomes about who can come up with the most morally righteous sort of ideas, because we don't have any power. So then it becomes sort of like a social media battle about who has the best ideas, who has the best thoughts, without any relation to who has the most power and who could build the power. So
interesting. Yeah, it's kind of like a low-hanging fruit in a left that has been neutered almost beyond belief. And I get it. I totally get it. And I get why it's important. But to be honest, I'm getting to a stage where I'm wondering how much even like framing things as morally right or even approaching this from like a moral perspective, I'm beginning to really question how helpful it is. Like, what is it that makes sense for the majority of people in a way that is like embodied, not, intellectual sense? What are the kind of politics that open up the common sense or empower a common sense?
Yes.
And how is it that you can speak to people in a way that also makes sense for them? Because if you go at a capitalist class and say to them, what you're doing is morally reprehensible because of X, Y, and Z, they are going to disagree with you because they obviously don't think it's morally reprehensible.
Mm-hmm.
And so immediately the conversation's kind of over. What these people do understand is the desire to secure a future for themselves. And I think this is the thing that sometimes like the left forget. Like, I think a lot about how the world could be better for the majority of people in the more than human world. And that is important to me intellectually, but it is like too big emotionally. I would be lying if I said that was like my emotional driver. Like, my emotional driver is for the people that I love and care about in the world. And I'm glad of my intellect to be able to like project that out to a bigger part of the world. And sometimes, like, when I see a tree being cut in a forest, I will feel emotionally upset about that because of these other things that I like learn about. Or if I see images of something awful happening on the other, yes, but like if it's not there in the vicinity in some kind of way, it's only going to be present as an intellectual thought rather than an emotional one. And so I think finding ways to engage with this, like with the limits, like the limits of our own empathy, essentially, and finding ways to like create, build up pools of like networks of empathy, so that it's not that each individual has to do it for the entire world, but that if we can do it for our bit of the world and then network into other people that are doing it for their part of the world and overlap, essentially, then you can create a safe world for everyone. Like even all of that kind of politics, even though all of
Mm-hmm.
those embodied politics has to be decentralized.
That's a really nice way to think about it, actually. And to me, it reminds me of how a lot of my sort of politics is really inspired by, again, these histories of, if you look at the sort of working class movements when they were powerful, and then if you think about the communist movements, there's this great book called The Romance of American Communism that just did oral histories of all these people that were part of the Communist Party in the United States in the 1930s. And the big overarching thing they say is they really felt like they were part of something that was world changing, that really had the capacity to change the entire world. This was a little bit before they became sort of aware of the horrors of Stalinism and so forth. So to be fair, but they really felt like, there was this world struggle happening, and they were on the fight for communism. And the fight for communism was not just about themselves, but was about the liberation of all of humanity. And that's literally what, if you look at the old, like the Internationale and these working class songs, and, really was about, emancipating the humanity as a whole. And people really felt they had this sort of worldview and political orientation where they're organizing in the party locally, as you suggest, like locally with their comrades, was actually part of a world-changing project. And I do think it's probably likely that we're not going to recover Marxism as it was, but I do think we need to recover that kind of idea that really it's not just about changing your local community, but it's about changing the entire world, because that's what the climate crisis requires. As you said, it's so huge. It requires sort of planetary scale power and planetary scale action. You could create your own little solar co-op and urban garden, but if you just create that little local solution, the sort of fossil fuel industrial complex will just churn along outside of it and destroy the planet around you. So I do think we need to, and going back to the sort of working class movement, there was that internationalism baked into it. This idea that we're part of an international working class movement, and that the class struggle here for us in this workplace is connected to struggles of workers all around the world. And I don't know how we recover that, but that seems to be so obviously what we need, that kind of internationalism, that kind of solidarity across borders, that kind of connection, that we're in a world fight, we're in a global fight for a certain class of people against another class of people. Like all these ideas were just part and parcel of the global socialist and working class movement. And unfortunately, that was crushed for the last several decades. And my sort of wager is we have to sort of rebuild it, and that would be the kind of rebuilding of that movement that could kind of rekindle the kind of empathy and solidarity you're sort of hinting to, where workers that go on strike in their local area will start to see themselves as part of a global initiative or global project.
And I think we are actually seeing that with regards to the genocide in Gaza around the world, which has been incredible and very inspiring to watch, and has really shifted the Overton window, I think, of what it is that we are capable of thinking or feeling or uniting behind, or how capable we are of standing up to power and refusing for the narrative to be deconstructed, essentially, which I think it's so important. Listen, Matt, this has been really, really interesting. Thank you so much for your time. I've made a whole bunch of notes. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
I've said this on other podcasts, but I always want to platform the organization Labor Notes, their slogan is "Put the movement back in the labor movement." And in many ways, they're trying to rebuild that power of the working class and the labor movement that's been so crushed over the last several decades. And in many ways, they're a movement also that's trying to combat kind of what they call business unionism, which is very top-down sort of bureaucratic unionism that's quite aligned with the capitalists, quite aligned with the bosses, and build up what they call a rank and file militant labor movement from the ground up. So that really means building workers' own capacities to build organization from the rank and file up, building democracy into the union movement so that actually empowers workers to take ownership and take participation in their unions seriously. And, they've been doing this, chipping away. They were founded in 1979, but in many ways, the recent upsurge in the United Auto Workers was a product of their sort of vision in organizing. And a lot of labor notes inspired rank and file activists actually formed this reform caucus in the UAW, which basically was about democratizing the union and actually making it so all the members of the union can actually vote on who the leadership is. And through those democratizations, they won those changes. They were able to elect the current leadership, which includes the current president, Sean Fain, who came from this reform caucus. This has been like absolutely inspiring. It was this new leadership that said, no, we're going to channel working class power. We're going to go on strike. We're going to force the bosses to give us concessions. And they won a record contracts like they hadn't won in decades. And I would add, from what you just said, this is the union that I'm pretty sure it was the first union to vote and endorse a ceasefire in for the genocide that's happening in Gaza. And that, to me, is again Sean Fain and others really trying to rechannel this large, more politically aware labor movement that doesn't just see labor and unions as having this quite narrow economistic kind of focus on, it's just wages and conditions for our workers, but sees unions and the labor movement as a larger political vehicle that's going to take a stand when things like human rights and human well-being are being destroyed. And so it's very inspiring. And so at any event, Labor Notes is a great organization there, and they're trying to kind of rekindle that kind of rank and file fighting labor movement in not only the UAW, but in unions all across the country. And I know they've
Excellent.
Inspired others around the world to think about union activism this way.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to speaking with them. Matt, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot for having me.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter inspired by each interview. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.